Thank you all for joining us tonight for this online program of the American Writers Museum. My name is Allison Sansoni. I'm the program director at the AWM. We're here tonight to talk about the things that we can't talk about. Leonard Marcus's new book, You Can't Say That, compiles essays from 13 award-winning authors of young people's literature about the ways in which their books have been challenged by those opposing First Amendment rights. Subjects like sex, racial injustice, gender identity, and LGBTQ themes all caused outcry for these authors, and You Can't Say That places their struggles in historical context and asks why some people feel they have the right to restrict access to books. Leonard Marcus is one of the world's leading writers about children's books and the people who create them. He's the award-winning author of more than 25 books, including Show Me a Story, Why Picture Books Matter, and Comics Confidential, 13 graphic novelists talk story, craft, and life outside the box. His essays, interviews, and reviews appear in the New York Times Book Review and Hornbook magazine. He's a founding trustee of the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art, teaches at New York University and the School of Visual Arts, and lectures about his work across the world. He's here tonight with Meg Medina, the 2019 Newbery medalist for Mercy Suarez Changes Gears, and the author of the new book, Mercy Suarez Can't Dance. The recipient of the Pura Belpré Author Award for her young adult novel, Yaqui Delgado Wants to Kick Your Ass. Meg Medina is also the author of a number of other books, including Tia Isa Wants a Car, for which she received the Ezra Jack Keats New Writer Award. Welcome to you both.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I'll be back to take some questions from the audience at the end, but for now, I'm going to leave you two to discuss.
Thank you.
Thanks, Allison.
Yeah, so I do want to thank Allison very much for arranging this program and the American Writers Museum for hosting it. And I want to thank Meg Medina for joining me this evening.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Meg is one of the writers that I interviewed for the book, You Can't Say That. And we got into a lot of aspects of censorship and what is involved in respecting and defending First Amendment rights in America. And so I think we'll have a chance to talk some more about that this evening. Before we do that, I thought, Meg, we should talk a little bit about your work, and starting with your life as not only a writer, but also as a reader and talker. And I wonder if you would say something about what it has meant to you to have grown up bilingual in America, and how being bilingual has influenced your work as a writer.
Oh, well, thanks. It's so fun to be here with you, first of all, Leonard. I'm a big fan of your work, so it feels exciting to be part of this collection. So growing up bilingual and bicultural, hyphenated, as some of us like to say, it wasn't something I give a lot of thought to until, my adult life. Growing up, it just was a fact of interpreting the world through two lenses, and going back and forth, code switching sort of constantly to make sense of the world. I grew up mostly in cities. In New York City, I grew up surrounded with many Latino people. And then later, my husband and I, as I grew up and got married and so on, I lived in Florida, also lots of Latino people. Then we moved to Richmond, Virginia, where we were raising our own children. And it was the first time where I was in a city where there weren't many Latino people. And it was a very scary decision for me to come live here, actually, at the time. I couldn't imagine raising kids without a context of their language and so on, and having no, not a lot of access to media in both languages and foods in the supermarket, all of that kind of thing. And sure enough, when we first moved here, my kids went to the public elementary school. They were the only Latino kids in their school at the time, which was just mind-blowing to me. And I do remember that my mother would come to visit. My mother and my tia Isa would come to visit, and we'd be anywhere, just chatting among ourselves about anything, or talking with the children in Spanish. And I remember the weight of people's looks and stares. So that has changed somewhat over the years. I've lived in Virginia now for 20 years, but that feeling of being an outsider suddenly in a city was very strongly felt. So when I write books, I try to center Latino families. I try to center how we use language, which is very in a very fluid way, from English to Spanish, very sometimes in the same sentence, right? And I try to remove that sense of other. And just what's been surprising over the years is that, for as celebratory as I feel about books that celebrate culture and so on, there are certainly people who find offense in that in some way celebrating one's culture is anti-American or unpatriotic in some way. And that's been painful, honestly.
Yeah, and it begins to really get at what's sometimes involved in efforts at censorship, doesn't it? People feeling uncomfortable, or worse than that, at people of a certain group expressing their cultural identity and maybe appearing to be threatening to the other people, the ones who are noticing.
Yeah. I was thinking about that when I was reading Matt de la Peña's essay, interview with you in this book, because of course his books were challenged as a part of a curriculum that was exploring Mexican American history.
Yeah.
And so it's really something when just the history of people, the reality of people is when that's construed as threatening to some sort of common identity, then the conversations really really get difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. So I also wanted to ask you, of all the kinds of books that you might be writing or might have chosen to write, how did you end up writing books for young people?
That's really funny. I think in life, in my own life, so many things pointed me this way, even though I couldn't have said this is what I'm going to do. I always loved writing. I always loved storytelling. But I was a teacher for many years. I was a teacher for 10 years. I've always worked in one way or another on behalf of children, whether it's been writing materials for organizations that support children's causes. And it just, all of those pieces of my life came together, my love of writing, my experience with children, and then this notion that I have that I feel like the books that we read as children stay with us forever in some way. We remember our favorite books. We remember where we were when we read them, or what they meant to us. They have such huge impact. Very different from, I think, the books that we love as adults. We read them, and 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, we can't quite remember the plot or what happened. But it's very different with children's books. And I think the thing about children's books that's really magical is that it's not only entertainment, it's just part of how children grow up. It's how they're learning to make sense of the world. It's how they're incorporating experiences that they're picking up vicariously through these stories that are being written for them. It's part of how they develop. And so that layer of importance, of impact, really appeals to me. And also because I found growing up really hard. I don't know, maybe you did as well.
Oh, no kidding.
Did you? Yeah,
Yes.
I did too. I mean, if people wanted me to do it again, I'd be like, right? And so I feel like I also write to make sense of that, for myself, and for, in some way, for kids coming behind me. I have no firm answers. I just have a way of retelling the experience and laying it out
Mhm.
in a way that allows them to interact and think and problem solve for their own situation.
Yeah. And so often children and teenagers don't have the words for the things that are happening to them.
No.
So have always thought as a historian and critic, reviewer of children's books, that one of the great values of the literature is that it kind of puts a frame around some of these intense but at the same time sort of shapeless experiences that
Yeah.
everyone has to go through one way or another on the way to becoming a grown person. And story itself, of course, is a shaping of experience. So it's a kind of life-giving resource, I think, for young people. Maybe that's why those books mean so much when we're, to in the first years of life.
I think so. I think there's that feeling you have when you feel seen, even if the person is very different from you, like the emotion, like when you can really relate to what a character is living through,
Mhm.
and because it's similar to what you're living through, or it just feel like you understand it really deeply. I think that makes such an impact on kids.
Mhm. Yeah, a lot of people are very dismissive of children's books. Like some
Oh, for sure.
big time literary critics will think, oh, children's books, they're so trivial and simple.
Yeah.
Simple is the word that's often used, and yet
Yeah.
when you look at the annual lists that the American Library Association publishes of the most frequently challenged books in America, or the top 10 or the top 25, the overwhelming majority of those books are books for young people.
Yeah.
And that's just a
Save
very,
the children.
yeah, so it must be that there's something about books for young people that is very good at touching the nerves of large groups of American society. Um, so, and what I've come to think as a historian is that children's books express the hopes and fears of each generation, and it's their way of passing those hopes and fears on to the next generation, almost like a message in a bottle, And so, so when the fear is what comes out, that's when the trouble starts, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe we should take a moment to define a couple of terms that get used all the time in these discussions, just so everyone is clear about what they mean. Um, Tell me, what does it mean for a book to be challenged, and how is that different from a book being banned?
Yeah. So there is the challenge is a parent or a group coming forward and saying, I don't think that this book belongs on the shelf because it's inappropriate for X reason, Y reason, etc. So they start a challenge often. Well, in the best of circumstances, there are procedures in place for how we handle those things. You have to make the complaint to the teacher, then to the principal. It goes to here. A committee reads the book. There's a whole series of steps. Banning is when a book is removed completely from a collection, and so what we have usually is many books being challenged, and those are just the ones we know about. There are so many other books that we don't find out about the challenges. They're not reported, or the censorship happens. You and I will talk about this later, I'm sure, in sort of backhanded ways. The books are kept in a special room collection, handed out personally by the librarian. There's any number of ways that adults like to get in the middle between kids and books that they want to read. So, but those are the chief differences in
Yeah.
the way I know it.
Yeah, and as you've begun to explain, there's so much smoke and mirrors surrounding lots of what passes, under the rubric of censorship in America. It's very hard. I mean, and for me, trying to put this book together, it was very hard for me to just sort of understand really what was going on a lot of the time. And probably the most famous, or certainly one of the most famous examples of book banning in America is the story of Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn. And when Huckleberry Finn, shortly after it was published, copies ended up on the shelves of the Concord, Massachusetts Public Library. And then the trustees of the library met and voted to remove the book from the library's shelves. And they made a public statement and said, oh, it's a vulgar book, it belongs in the gutter, it's not for us. To which Mark Twain famously responded, well, in that case, I'm sure it'll be good for an extra 25,000 copies in sales. So he, turned it into a kind of boast, Mark Twain style. But I think there's a kind of mythology around that story and what it represents, because you could easily interpret it to mean, well, so what's the big deal? So people objected to the book, but it ended up reaching a lot of people anyhow, and the author actually benefited. So what's the problem? So tell me, in your experience, what is wrong with that way of understanding that story?
Yeah, so I hear that all the time, among authors right now, like, go ahead, ban my book, it'll sell more copies. And also it's in some circles held as a badge of honor. Like, go ahead, I wrote something edgy, I wrote something in your face and true, and good for me. So here's the thing though, lots of people get hurt and troubled in situations like this. So for me, for example, the first feeling, regardless of, my book, Yaqui Delgado Wants to Kick Your Ass, is a good example, right? The word ass ended up being quite a problem for the book. And so it takes a minute to absorb when you have spent your life as, I'm somebody's mother, I was a teacher, I'm a responsible author. It takes a minute to really absorb the weight of a community saying that you have done something vulgar and hurtful for children, right? So there's the first emotional blush of it. There are the ways that teachers are hurt and principals are hurt in all of this. Think of a teacher's life right now, right? In terms of selecting books that he or she or they want to use in the classroom. And all of the things that they're facing. When your book is challenged, the amount of paperwork, the amount of hassle that goes on between the teacher and the person making the challenge is enormous. There's a lot of pressure from principals who will say, can't you just pick another book and be a good staff person, please? Must you create this embarrassing situation that's going to come through the community, that's going to be on the media, et cetera? Sometimes I've had the experience of wonderful principals who stuck with their teachers, but then this becomes the nightmare of the principal who has to face their superintendent and so on. And then the biggest one of all, I think, is of course, the children. After I got disinvited to a school in my own home state, they were doing, ironically, an assembly about bullying. And the librarian had invited me because this book centers a young woman being bullied. After I was disinvited from the school, I received emails from students saying, I'm embarrassed and I'm so sorry that my school has done this. It also cut the kids from being able to access a book that some kids really needed and wanted to read for whatever reason, whether they've been bullied themselves, whether this is an issue at their school, which I have to assume was part of the deal since they were doing an assembly about this. So it's sort of this pervasive, it's this long-ranging thing. Like on the one hand, sure, maybe you will get, sales will go up for X amount of time or whatever, but the larger cost to kids, to teachers, to the author. And also the last one, which I always struggle with, is the sense of trust between children and adults. It becomes a really strained issue. In the case of Yaqui Delgado Wants to Kick Your Ass, for example, one of the things I said to the school is, they wanted me to distance myself from the title. I could come, they said, if I didn't show the cover of the book, if I never said the word ass, if I didn't, completely just back off from all of those things. And here's the thing. I was sure that high school students had heard the word, A. And B, this book deals a lot also with the language of bullying girls, which is often around sexual things. You know, we sexualize them with words like slut and so on. And so we as adults are asking kids to trust us, to talk to them, or have them talk to us about really difficult things going on in their lives, such as bullying. But we can't even name the thing accurately, or we can't even find it in ourselves to say, yes, this is happening. These are the words that are being used. This is what's going on. So it feels like a cheap shot against children to me when we do things like that. So, I mean, that's been my own experience. I just don't think it's a simple thing to say, okay, fine, my sales will go up. I think it's much deeper, and it's a long sting. You know, it feels hard.
Yeah, and I think it's like some of the teachers and librarians you've alluded to, they might have trouble with their colleagues at the water cooler.
Sure.
I've heard of an example of a librarian having her tires slashed,
Oh gosh.
things like that. People losing their jobs. There was a case a number of years ago, 1958, of a picture book called The Rabbit's Wedding, written and illustrated by Garth Williams, who's everyone would know as the illustrator of Charlotte's Web and Little House books, but he also made some picture books of his own. And this happened to be a story about a white rabbit and a black rabbit who meet in a beautiful forest setting, become friends, fall in love, and marry each other. And you see this very kind of idyllic, flower-strewn ceremony at the end. And it's this charming little story, but it was seen in Alabama as a secret plea on behalf of interracial marriage, and therefore, a deep threat to segregationist South. So the book was discussed in very heated terms. It ended up being locked up in a case in the State Library of Alabama. And ultimately, the librarian, the person who held the post of librarian for the state, was forced from her job. So it can have that kind of consequence. And it can also, someone who's purchasing a book for a school, whether a teacher, librarian, whoever it is, may have weathered one of these situations, but then think twice the next time, or the publisher, may, who gets tangled up in these events too sometimes, may think, well, next time I'm just, going to go with a simpler book, something that's not going to ruffle anybody's feathers. So what you end up getting from all this, or the sum of it all, is a contraction of our culture.
And anything can be insulting. I was reading in your forward the notion that the word toilet on the Captain Kangaroo show.
Yes.
That's it. It's a no. What can't be said on television, and there's so many can'ts, right? That change over time, that we evolve, that life expands, our thinking expands, and that's a good thing. We seem to learn nothing. We go back onto these same sort of ways of responding. What you referred to, I think, as the impulse to censor, the impulse to take on this badge of, I am protecting X, I am protecting children, I am protecting this country, I am protecting our whatever, our morals.
Yeah. So something else you've already referred to, and I heard from other people that I interviewed, including Angie Thomas, the author of The Hate U Give, is that sometimes when a book is challenged, the stated reason for the challenge is probably not the real reason for the challenge.
Right.
And Um, and in
Right.
her case, as with yours, coarse language was frequently cited, but in her book, of course, it's the story of a shooting of an unarmed Black teenager by a white policeman, and everything that happened as a result of that. And that was like too sort of hot to handle, for people to speak publicly about it as the reason that that book made them, unnerve them or made them uncomfortable in some way.
Of course.
And
And the question I always have, especially with Angie's work, right? So, all right, it makes you uncomfortable, but what do you think children are seeing on the television in the evening, on the news, in the newspaper? It's all around us, and so I just think it's a much wiser thing to provide materials that allow for nuance, that allow for consideration of many points of view, that allow space for conversation, for new ways of seeing. It's not a threat. It's actually, I think, what should be happening in schools. This notion of bringing us to the table to have the uncomfortable conversations, in the hope that we expand, that we can create nuanced, deep thinking people.
yeah. I mean, from what I've noticed, like children's books went through a really big change around the 1960s, and
Yeah.
it sort of shifted from a focus on not leaving morality aside, but thinking of the child as a sort of idealized moral being, shifting away from that toward the child as a psychological being who is full of all sorts of contradictions and feelings and needs and urges and everything else, and imperfect, but real, And what I think I see very often in the people who set themselves up as censors is a kind of clinging to that older view of what children's books should be like, as a reflection of what they think childhood should be like.
Right. Yeah. Listen, I feel in my heart, I want childhood to be sacred, right? It truly, I raised 3 children. My children are all grown, but I think every parent wants their children to have a happy life, a life that's full of good things and experiences that build them up, right? But the fact is, right, that the world is a much more complex place, and when I'm thinking of that shift that you're describing, I'm thinking of Judy Blume's work, right?
That's
And
right.
Judy Blume, of course,
She's a part
has
of
been
that.
such a
Yeah.
right. She's been so huge in, for example, in the National Coalition Against Censorship. And I'm about to drop this in the chat, folks, because they have a wonderful toolkit for if what happens if a book is challenged at your school, and it's written for kids so that kids sort of understand the issue and can feel some agency about how you respond to this. But anyway, I feel like I remember reading Judy's work as a child myself, and the relief I felt in seeing a character speak and feel the things that were sort of forbidden to Dick and Jane and Sally and whoever the other one was. Who was with Sally? The other kid. Do you remember? He had a name.
Would you be thinking of Spot?
No, I remember
Oh.
Spot, but there was Sally and somebody else. If somebody else knows, throw it in the chat. But anyway, I just feel like it was such a relief. And I don't know. I mean, what's the next shift? We have the psychological being, and now I feel like we have like the child with agency, right, around social issues, around their sense of self and autonomy and self-direction. Like I really see so much literature that's sort of celebrating that, and social justice and all of those issues, climate issues, like all of that. Which is, of course, brings us back to people saying, no, we can't have that discussion, right? But our whole country is sort of the egg is cracking along that fissure. Yeah.
That's very interesting. So tell me what is meant by this term that I learned from you, and seems to be so expressive of what we're talking about, soft censorship.
Yes.
What is,
So
what is that?
yeah. So soft censorship is, I call it sneaky censorship, because in my mind, censorship is anytime really an adult is trying to get between a book and a kid, right? For reasons that make the adult uncomfortable, right? So you'll have very well-intentioned librarians say, I keep your book at my desk, and kids who want it can come and check it out from me. Or they will put my book in a display, but they make sure that they hide the cover, or they'll list all of my books when they're doing an introduction of me, and Meg Medina, she's the author of this, da, 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 da. And Yaki Delgado doesn't end up on that list anywhere, even though it was, it won an award and so on. So it's all these ways that sort of hide the book, or hide it from view of children, or impact access. And the hard thing about soft censorship is that it's very hard to track, right? Because you can't point exactly to this ban, or this, this time that you made this official call to have the book reviewed or whatever. I almost prefer that, because then you actually know what you're working with, right? You know who's challenging the book,
That's
what the situation is. But when it's this sort of hidden stuff, and sometimes by people who are your allies, right? Librarians who don't want to make waves, let's say with their principal, or PTAs or anything like that. It becomes tricky, but I think it's very effective, unfortunately.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight something you said a while ago, which is that um, the when the most frequently challenged books are toted up every year for that American Library Association list, it's never a complete list.
No.
And the reason, and you'd mentioned that a lot of times these incidents are not reported, but the point I want to emphasize is the reason they're not reported is because it is so taxing on all the people who become involved in the process of deciding whether or not a book should end up staying there. It's like it's already emotionally draining, and then to make a public thing of it makes it even more so. So that's another reason why we just don't know how much of this is going on, at any given time, and probably why people can sort of do it, because they're kind of hiding behind a bush as they do it. Yeah. So also I wanted to bring out more, just a little bit more clearly, the problem with saying about a controversial book, okay, we'll keep it in the library, but we'll put it on a special shelf. So that sounds like a good compromise. What's wrong with that picture?
Okay, I think that what's wrong with that picture is that it others the book, so to speak, right? It segregates the book. It creates it's like people who say, all right, but we're going to put a sticker on this book that says this has bad language and so on. It does have the word ass, but it also has literary merit. Are you going to put other stickers that say it also has great so I think it's signaling. It signals these sort of superficial things without a deep look at the book. So I'm not for stickers. I'm not for special shelves. I'm not for having to go to the principal or the librarian. I don't like having to bring a special note from home that says that you're allowed to read this book, which has also been done to me with this book. I feel like I feel like we should trust children to read the books that they want to read, and to have questions about them, and to be able to talk about the questions they have. I feel that's the most respectful thing that we can do. And as a parent, I think you absolutely have the right to decide that you're not comfortable with something, and that's a discussion that you can have with your child. I think that you're certainly within your rights to talk to the teacher and say, is there another book that we can read instead? This isn't something that my child and I are comfortable with. I have enormous problem with you deciding that because you are uncomfortable with a book, that no one has access to it. So there are all those things. And so I try to be charitable about this because I guess because I'm a mom, and because I feel like they're not monster people out to be vicious. Their impulse is that they love their children and they want what's best for their children. I disagree with what they want, but this is, I think, what's at the core of it. So that's as far as I can go. So absolutely, you can make another choice for your child, but you really can't make the choice for everybody's child. I don't, that just can't stand with me. Yeah.
Yeah. There are two epigraphs to my book, and one of them is the Webster Merriam definition of censor. The other one is a quote from a poem by William Stafford. And it's two lines. It's hard being a person. Everyone knows that. And I put that there because out of at least a nod to the possible goodwill of the people who engage in censorship, that, as you've just, I think, eloquently described, there are many people who do act as censors, or try to think at least that they're doing it from a good place, and yet maybe it needs rethinking sometimes.
You can censor from either side of the political spectrum as well. You know what I'm saying? You can decide that something is deeply offensive because of portrayals and so on. I mean, there are a lot of ways that this gets really murky and difficult. But I think I always default to the literary merit of the work, and not getting in between a child and a book that they want to read. I mean, Yaki Delgado Wants to Kick Your Ass ends up getting stolen from libraries a lot. And I kind of love that. I don't like that children are stealing, but I think it speaks to a larger truth here, Leonard, which is that children will reach for the book that they need to have.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And they feel ashamed, or they feel blocked, or whatever, they're going to have that book.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't feel like it's a sensible way to go to create all of these layers of difficulty for kids to read. I think they have the right to read. And I saw that Allison put on in the chat the National Coalition Against Censorship. And I think you'll find that so interesting, especially the young people in the audience, because it's a whole toolkit for what happens when someone challenges a book at your school, what you can do.
Yeah. And there's so many things I want to ask you about, but I want to make you feel better by telling you that when Judy Blume was a little girl, she borrowed Ludwig Bemelman's Madeline from the public library. And because she thought it was really a story about herself, she refused to return that book.
You see, we're all thieves.
Huh. Yeah. And it's another story I wanted to tell from one of the other interviews. Roby Harris has written probably the classic book on human sexuality for children, called It's Perfectly Normal, as well as many other books. But she told the story about why it was essential in one child's life for that book to be on open shelves rather than on a special shelf. A girl went to this library with her mother. It was a single parent situation. The mother said, you can borrow whatever book you like. This girl found It's Perfectly Normal on the open shelf. She took it home and started reading it in her room, and then came out to talk to her mother and pointed to the section on sexual abuse and said, this is what happened when my father, your husband, was living with us. And she had never talked to her mother about that before, and probably had never had a way, again, had not had the words to talk about it before. But the book gave her the means to communicate something really terrible and significant that had happened to her. It led to a court case and, to a better life for that family. But if the book had been locked away, and this, I mean, you can't imagine that girl asking, even if she knew about it, to see the book. I mean, how hard would that be?
Right.
So in the real world, it really makes a difference how accessible books are.
Agreed. I remember that story. It was wonderful. And I was thinking about another author because I was at the library today reading picture books. I love to do that, just sort of go to my local library and surround myself. And I saw Leslie Newman's books. I think it's called Sparkle Girl.
Sparkle Boy.
Oh, Sparkle Boy, right.
Oh, yeah.
And it was lovely to see.
Oh, yeah. And of course, she's best known for Heather Has Two Mommies, a book that became a major cultural phenomenon when The Simpsons devoted a whole episode to.
You got to have The Simpsons. You got to have, that's the only way, right?
Yeah. But one of the great things that she said in the interview with her is, she said, well, there are two things that she has to say to parents who, as often happens, believe that if their child reads a book about being gay, their child is more likely to be gay, to become gay, to sort of be converted to gayishness, or whatever, however you would put it.
Right.
She said, well, here are my two answers. One is, she's speaking for herself, I've read thousands of books about heterosexual children, and they've never turned me into a heterosexual person. So literature apparently doesn't have that power, that kind of power. And the other answer is, don't you want your child to be happy?
Yeah. There it is.
Yeah.
Don't you want to respect your child?
Yeah.
And that's a thing. I feel like it's so hard for some folks to see it that way. They see the inconvenience, they see maybe public embarrassment, they see certainly now the power of what it feels like really to be caught in contentious, ugly public conflicts, right? And everybody's running from those, right? But it really does ultimately rest on the idea of, what do we believe that kids have a right to? And I believe they have a right to information, accurate information. I think they have a right to choose books to read that feel good to them, that feel appropriate to them, and that interest them. And I think that we should get out of the way of that. We should get out of the way of blocking any of those things.
Yeah. If we have time, I'd like to tell one quick story about my own son, who was about maybe 3 years old when this happened. I took him to the public library one day, and he spotted a book that was face out on the shelf and was just magnetized by it. So we went over to have a look, and it was a story about a werewolf, and it was one of the Goosebumps books by R.L. Stine, who was for many years a major target of book challenges. And my son just couldn't get enough of this werewolf, it seemed. So I said to him, well, I can borrow this book and I can read it to you this evening. And suddenly Jacob's face completely changed. And it was so clear that he didn't want to know what was inside that book. Looking at the picture was his limit, and for me, the lesson of that story is that children are self-regulating. And they know what's good for them, and they often know what's not good for them. And that definitely applies to books. So I think it bolsters what you were saying a moment ago about how if you give children the choice, they're probably going to make good choices for themselves.
I think so, especially if you talk to them about these things, right? If you talk to them, how do you select a book? How do you know if a book is too much for you? What do you do? Like I remember as a kid putting books down and coming back to them later. For some reason, The Witch of Blackbird Pond, that classic, I tried to read it maybe in the third grade, second or third grade, and it was too much. I
Mhm.
couldn't unlock the words. It wasn't, and I remember just casting it aside. Then I read it again in the sixth grade and loved the book, right? And so I do think that kids can come back to it, but you can put a book down, you can come back to it, you can what do you do if you have questions about a book? How do we talk about it? I mean, there's just so it's it can be such a connection between parents and kids. This
Mhm.
notion of what we're reading, what we're feeding our brains and our hearts, rather than a control model, or a model where we deem these appropriate and this is what you may digest. I Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if there are questions from people who are joining us.
I see a couple. Allison was going to field them for us. I see her W.
Here we
There
are. Let
Hi,
me
Right.
just
Okay.
Allison.
start my
Yeah.
video.
Oh, yeah.
Hi.
All right, I'm back.
Oh, great.
Thank you for such a wonderful discussion. And I just want to remind people that if they have questions, to please type them into the Q&A box. And that's what we're looking for. And so our first question is from E.M. Strickbine, who is asking, do you think as far as banning books that it can ever be presented to the author to change those elements that people find questionable, such as changing the color of the bunny rabbits to avoid anybody misunderstanding the essential story that's being told?
Huh. Well, I mean, I think that has historically, there have been times when authors have been asked to change their books, but I think more often than not, authors prefer not to.
Yeah, I think that comes up. Sometimes it'll be an illustration. I think illustrators really get dinged in these areas as well. Can you change this? Can you do that? For all kinds of reasons, I don't know. I'm trying to picture my own reaction to being asked to change something, so as not to create pain or aggravation for someone. I don't know. I can't see a scenario. It would where that would be the reason that I would say, you're right, let's do this. I think most authors of children's work are really invested in the notion of being honest with children, right? And really writing as honest a book as they can for them. So I think, changing or manipulating things so we don't upset X, Y, or Z would be really suspect. It would be a hard sell. I'm sure there are authors out there who have changed something, but typically I would say it would be a hard sell.
I mean, authors and illustrators are asked to change things by their editors all the time. So it really has to do with what the motive is, and
Right.
what is being what the concern is. I
Right.
mean, it's trying to make it a better story or a more culturally inclusive story. That's one thing. If it's trying to avoid getting banned in Alabama, that's different.
Right. Right. Now, I will say that typically your editor will say to you, here's what could happen. You write this and here's what could happen. And then it's really on the author to decide, am I, okay, am I good with what that could mean? Or conversely, is it a really legitimate point? Like, this is deeply offensive because of this, right? Like, is that a point that I should really think about? So there's lots of different scenarios, but I think the notion of not upsetting people would be hard for most authors to swallow.
Yeah.
Is that something that either of you have ever been, has an editor ever gone through, or a publicist, and said, look, these are the problems that we might run into if it's X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, I was thinking about this book, Leonard, because I asked you, I think this book will end up being censored.
I can't wait.
I do. I think
that's actually not
that
true.
somebody's going to say
Oh no.
that Leonard
I hope
Martin's
not. Yeah,
mommy guy.
yeah. I don't think it would be fun. I wasn't seeking that out. I mean, what I was really hoping to do was show by the model of interviews what a good conversation about a complicated or challenging or controversial book can be like. Because I mean, what you sometimes see on social media these days is the opposite of a conversation, which is a rant, where someone is attacking without any interest in hearing the other side. So, I would hope that we could get back to discussing things.
Yeah. From your lips to God's ears, isn't that the expression? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think tonight has been a wonderful start to that conversation. And I hope as the book comes out that we have many, many more of these conversations with you and with the authors contained in this book.
Thank
I
you.
just want to remind people that the link to purchase at Seminary Co-op, there's the book. The link to purchase is in the chat. So if folks want to do that, they can look there. So we have a question from Lisa Silverman, who asks, what exactly happens when a case of censorship is reported to either the ALA or the NCAC? Do they investigate and publicize it? Do they just create a list of incidents?
It's more than just creating a list.
Yeah.
I mean, I know Meg, why don't you go ahead?
Well, my experience with NCAC, I don't know about ALA, so maybe you can add that piece, but I know with the National Association of Against Censorship, so you report it, right? Anyone can report it, but I reported, I've been disinvited from a school, blah, blah, blah. They open the case, someone calls you. They called me and they interviewed me and they asked me what happened. They wrote a letter to the school. I believe they also reach out to your publisher. And so what they're trying to create, they try to intercede and talk with the powers that be at the school or whoever's censoring you, to get to the bottom of why, what's the reason, and try to resolve the situation. Then I'm trying to think of other things. They gave me lots of links, lots of toolkits, things that I could offer to the students and the parent groups, sample letters that I could help write to the school, ways that I could be helpful to them as they moved through the formal challenge process. So it just sort of gives you a roadmap and some support.
And I think often what the publisher will do is, among other things, supply copies of reviews of the book that's being challenged. And the point of doing that is to show that, serious, trained people have made a judgment about this book, that it's worthwhile. They're not saying that it's for every single child, but they're saying it's a very credible choice to have in a public library. And I mean, there was one librarian who was quoted in my book in the interview with Roby Harris saying, about her sexuality book, I would never have this book in my home, for my own children. But as a librarian, I feel that it needs to be in the library for people to have the choice, the opportunity to either read it or not read it. That's a really noble response, to a complicated situation. And I think that, part of the gist of what the respondents to challenges aim for is that understanding that even though a book may not be for everyone, there are certain books that deserve to receive serious consideration from the community.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to thank both of you for being here tonight and for this fascinating discussion. And again, the book is You Can't Say That, and you can order it from our link at our bookstore partner in the chat window. But thank you, Leonard and Meg, for being here for this wonderful conversation. And we wish you the best of luck with the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Have a good night, everyone.
Take care.